A Stranger in a Strange Land. And if you were here in January, if you saw the one in January, it was New Destinations, where we looked at the role of setting in stories. Sort of taking setting as a character and how it influences the story. What we're doing today is something sort of the flip side of that. So we're looking at characters seeing new places. So we as the readers are seeing the new places through these characters, or old places in a new way perhaps. So what I would like to do first is perhaps we have 4 authors each have their books here, so I can just introduce them, their book that they'll be discussing mostly for this time. I mean, there are a lot of other books, of course. And then they'll do a short reading from the book, and then we'll sort of continue on from there. So I guess we might as well start with Rosemary. So Rosemary kind of, a couple of years now from the previous version of one of Yorkshire authors, as it were. And you'll be mostly reading from your New York Orphans series. Yeah. So yeah.
The series is the Tales of Flynn and Riley. It takes the story of a family who moved from Ireland as a result of the potato famine and go to America. The Blight and the Blarney is the most recent that I've brought out. It's actually the prequel to the series, and it's a novella telling the story of what happens with the family back in Ireland and the whole impetus for the move. I'll do a short reading from the start of New York Orphan, which is where Daniel has arrived in New York. His parents have died on the ship going over there. I know that is a bit of a spoiler for the first one, but Daniel Flynn looked around at the magnificent warehouses, grown tall around the dock. They must have been higher than the trees around Loch Lean, higher than he could have imagined until he saw them. Whilst they displayed a majesty all their own, they shared none of the sweet meadow smell. Daniel found the noise and bustle oppressive. He swallowed hard. He had no idea what to do. He was 7 years old and arriving in a strange land alone. He shuddered. He was used to the single-storey, tumble-down cottages scattered around the lanes, not these huge buildings of brick and timber, piled ramshackle as far as his eyes could see. You fetid lumps of bog rot, go back to where you came from. A man, in plaid trousers and a bright, well-tailored jacket, with an accent as alien as the buildings, hurled insults at the hundreds of starving Irish families descending from the ship. Shoulders dropped, Daniel drew his rag-wrapped belongings closer to the tiny frame of his beleaguered body. He walked a few faltering steps before looking back at the open expanse of rigging against the cloudless sky. And I'll leave it at that point. But it shows you completely in moving to a completely strange land.
So next we have K.S. Marsden, Kelly.
One of my first series is the Witch Hunter series, and I'll be discussing, it starts with the Shadow Rises, which is, again, free to download on Kindle, if you're interested in that. And it's almost an alternate version of our world, where witches are real and they're evil and there's professional witch hunters. So last night was real. I mean, what happened and why? Hunter didn't reply immediately, but brought through 2 cups of steaming coffee and invited his guest to sit down. If you don't mind me asking, had you known those girls long? The girls shrugged. A few days, they were at the same hotel as me. I was on holiday alone and they were friendly, inviting me out day and night. I thought they were okay. It was their job to gain your confidence, but they were going to kill you, to sacrifice you last night. They were witches. Hunter glanced up as he finished speaking, watching her carefully. Witches, as in fire burn and cauldron bubble. You've got to be joking. No, I'm completely serious, he replied, with an apologetic smile. Witches are real, and to be blunt, they're all evil, black-hearted. I'm sorry you've got involved. If we were in England, I could offer you something to erase the memory.
And Darren, so you had a Books and Beverages recently,
yes,
where you were reading from and discussing your book, Closing Shop, which is apparently been shortlisted for the People's Book Prize.
People's Book Prize, I just found out this morning, so yes. This is my first novel, Closing Shop, and as it's been mentioned, it's in for an award, so fingers crossed for that one. I also have the sequel called The Sword of Uncreation, which is actually coming out on Tuesday, so unfortunately I couldn't bring that with me, but maybe next time. And it's a simple tale, and it's all in a series. So if you think of Terry Pratchett and his Discworld novels, mine's called Hell and Heaven. So that gives you an idea of the settings. And basically, I've got free rein with creating demons, angels, and putting them into situations either in hell, heaven, or on earth that fits my own strange imagination. Deedon had materialised on Oahu several hours earlier, but he'd been cautious and decided to reconnoitre the grounds of the resort before he entered the main building. He doubted there would be any traps, though there was no harm in making sure. The large golf course didn't look any more suspicious than any other golf course did. The golfers themselves appeared to have obtained their clothing from a tailor who was already destined for hell and no longer cared about the style or panache. But he saw no saviour demons lying in wait for him in the sand traps or umbido demons in the water hazards. He'd surveyed the stables and admired the horses. He was relieved to discover they were calm when he observed them from a distance. They had a sixth sense of recognising angels and demons, so they started to get a little bit skittish when he approached, but he soon calmed them. The simple fact that they were calm before he got to them assured them that there was no Beijing demons disguised as cats lurking in the shadows. He'd even taken the opportunity to take off his shoes and socks and enjoy the sensation of the sand between his toes on the beach. It was a simple pleasure, but he enjoyed it greatly, and he seldom had time to appreciate such things in heaven. There were so many delights, the little ones often went unnoticed. There was also the added benefits of lots of slim, tan, bikini-clad women. Such sightseeing wasn't forbidden in heaven, but being such a high-ranking angel meant he was expected to set a good example and behave himself.
You have a number of books that would fit in the theme of this topic, but today I think you've chosen Workhouse Warfare.
Yes. I thought that rather than going to a strange land as we might think about it, either fantasy or actually abroad, I'd focus on this. I know that one or two people here were at the talk I gave on it for Books and Beverages. It's about a young boy, the turn of the 19th, 20th century, who is plucked out of his London workhouse and sent up to Yorkshire to work in a mining village. And it is loosely based on somebody in my family history. Because this really did happen to somebody, and also my own dad, when he was 7, was moved up from London to Durham, I was very conscious of how difficult it would be to fit into a different part of our own country. Workhouse orphans had no say in their future. While girls generally went into domestic service, a boy not apprenticed to a trade or hired out as a labourer might easily be sent to sea and never heard of again. At least that would not be David's own fate. The master had responded to an appeal for strong lads to work in the Yorkshire coalfield. David had never been north of the Thames before, and it seemed unimaginably far away. There was no time to think about that now, though. With a change of clothes and a newspaper parcel of bread and cheese each, he and 6 other boys were marched off to catch their train. The master was to accompany them to the little West Riding town of Brighouse, from where their new employers would arrange for them to be collected. So he goes up to Brighouse on the train. It's a long, long journey. They have to change in Leeds. And then he and the other boys are packed off in a cart to go to the village where they're going to be working. Their last link with the past gone, the boys huddled together for warmth as the cart sent to collect them rattled along mile after mile of narrow country lanes. Unable to see what lay beyond, they fell asleep one by one. David awoke as a rock-like fist grasped his arm. "There's here, lad," said a cheerful voice. "Welcome to Greenleigh Village. Look sharp now." On his feet and trying not to shiver in case it made him look scared, David blinked up at his new master. "I'll not kid thee," said Mr. Sutcliffe Cawthra, whose other fist was clutching a paraffin lamp. "They'll have to work hard and they'll feel my belt across their backside if they gives me any lip. But there'll always be a fire and hot meal to come with Mrs. and me and as bonny bairns." David scarcely understood a word of the broad northern speech, but a sudden gleam of hope shone in his eyes as the miner cuffed him gently on the shoulder and winked.
So I wanted to maybe start with Kelly and Darren, because you created sort of the fantasy world. So we'll start there and then we'll move to the real world, shall we say. So Kelly, so what made you set it in Europe? Is that
I like the idea of everything that we think is familiar. Perhaps there's a hidden world there. You know, there's the hidden world of the witches versus the witch hunters, and it doesn't matter whether it's set in Venice and you know you've got your holiday and your tourists and your bright lights and you're going out drinking in restaurants, and actually there's still witches in the background sacrificing innocents. That you have to blame my family. It's a long-running family joke that all the women in my family are witches. And my nana, if we misbehaved, she'd turn us into toads.
And so Darren, you're something somewhat similar, but a bit more of it. So your book is set largely in Hawaii, but not entirely, obviously. You've created your version of heaven and hell, which a lot of the book is set in as well.
Yes, I mean, the actual hell and heaven, this, if you can read any theological books, and it'll give you their own interpretation of what hell is like and what heaven is like, and obviously the modern interpretation of what hell is was thanks to Dante and his Rings of Hell. But I thought, well, let's take that and play fast and loose with his interpretation, and I tried to go against people's interpretations of what hell would be and what heaven would be. And if I were trying to make Satan, if I was just making him this big red guy that's always angry and always blowing things up and killing and torturing and suffering pain, it would be so two-dimensional. It'd be sort of, right, okay, right, it's just going to do that and it's going to do that. So I tried to have sort of calm in amongst the rages so that he's got, so people don't know what to expect from him. And that's probably more frightening than if someone's just shouting and ranting and raving all the time again.
I wanted to emphasize also that yours is set around 1850. Is that
Start from 1854.
And Maggie's is around 1900-ish. And so compared to now, it's a little bit of a fantasy world as well. Not fantasy in necessarily a good way.
Much of the history is recorded, so you can go back and you can find out. But it's just on the cusp of whether things actually did get documented or not. So for the sequel to this, in particular, I need to know what the women's movement fighting for rights for women was called in 1867 in parts of America. You can find out, you find lots of documents that say from 1869 or thereabouts it became known as, but they don't tell you what it was before that. So it's interesting because you do have to make things up as far as within the parameters of what you can find out. So if something can't be disproved, then I will accept a name that sounds in keeping, but if I can actually find the right information, then I don't like making things up that could be disproved within the history. I mean, the fun thing on the cover of the Autumn Train was trying to get a picture of exactly the right type of train for that rail line for that year, because there are so many rail enthusiasts who will know if you've got the wrong wheel configuration. When I'm writing back in Ireland about the diet, but it really was potato based. So it's trying to make it realistic. How many different ways can you cook a potato? Add to tone the New York scenes down. If I had written the reality of life on the streets of New York, then readers would not have wanted to read on because it really was dreadful circumstances. And in Ireland, during the famine, life was very bleak. And it's conveying enough of that with the fact that they had to keep going. So they had to have times where they would still be dancing a jig despite the fact they were starving.
Did you find something similar, Maggie, with your stories?
Yes, I wrote it largely with the younger reader in mind and tried to put give it a positive ending, fairly upbeat. Not rags to riches, something that I hope is realistic. But yes, I did a tremendous amount of research, both about what it was like to work in a coal mine in the 1900s, what sort of work a boy of 12 would have been expected to do, what his daily life would have been like, And also because he was from a workhouse, and it's a big part of the story that his brothers and sister are still trapped in the workhouse. A lot about that too. As Rosemary was saying, you've got to be so careful. My book is set 50 years after hers, and both workhouses and coal mining were very, very well documented.
So I wanted to sort of open the next question up to everyone a little bit, just sort of about the structure of your story. So, because really the stranger in a strange land idea, so the reader is ultimately the stranger coming in through the eyes of your main characters. And so therefore, in reality, any points of view could be used in the story to show what you want to show. But sort of why you chose that perspective?
Well, I actually started with the villain. I decided, so the villain of my story was going to be the biggest, baddest witch, unstoppable powers, and then it was a question of who would stop that person. And then it came up with witch hunters, and even though this is a fantasy book and it's a modern book, I also did a lot of research into the history of it.
Point to take, but I was wondering if
There's actually 3 viewpoints in New York Orphan. It's the 3 orphans because their story, they go in separate directions. The orphan train takes them to different locations. So you get Daniel, Molly and Tom's points of view, and the chapters you alternate in terms of bringing the story back together. But I complicated it in some ways for myself when I decided to write a prequel, because Daniel is only 7 when he gets to New York. If I tried to write the prequel from Daniel's point of view, starting with him at the age of something like 4 or 5, I couldn't have got over the depth and the level of emotion that was needed for the situation. So I actually have gone back to Daniel's father.
I was going to say, when you've got hell, you can't have God going to hell and talking and being in that scene or chapter, and you can't have it the other way around in heaven, because Satan can't go there. So there are certain diversifications, and when it is on earth, you've got demons doing things, and then you've got angels. Although the central character is called Deedon, and he's the angel with shadow, shall we say, and he does have a striking resemblance to me. So basically balding, slightly overweight, and things like that. But because he's so inconspicuous, he could create whatever shape and form he wanted to be, but he also sort of goes for the same form that he was as a human being.
Well, I was captivated by tales I heard as a child about a workhouse boy who came up from London and married one of my great aunts. That was really all I knew. But his memory's been kept very green within the family. And in fact, the original, his name was David, and I've called him David in the book as well. His life was very short. I think the period of happiness he had with my great aunt was probably only a few months, because he was killed in the First World War. And if you happen to pick up a copy, there is some at the back, and look at the dedication. There's a very small photograph taken from a big regimental one, which shows a young man sitting behind a Lewis gun, and that was the actual David. He was only 21 when he died. So this book is a reimagining of how his childhood must have been, as I didn't want it to end sadly. So the book ends when the main character is about 14, going on 14. But everything that happens in the book is witnessed by him. It's told in the 3rd person, but always through his eyes.
Can the cameraman ask a question? I was particularly interested in your description of heaven and hell. But I also take a similar view. My book's not about heaven and hell, but it is about demons, and there is a person called God, and I've taken a slightly different view of what God is and a slightly different view of what a demon is. Have you had any, and I've had quite a few comments about how dare I? Have you had any of those kind of comments?
Well, I'm proud to say that I've upset the Westbury Baptist Church.
Kelly, you have the same issue because witches are also sort of antichrist type. Have you had any sort of negative feedback from that?
Yes, but there's an asterisk next to it. I have had feedback saying a lot of people don't really like the whole witches is evil shtick, that's in the first book, but the trilogy is actually about, it starts with Hunter and the Witch Hunters being the heroes, and the witches being evil, and that's how it is, it's black and white. But then it kind of sort of gets grey, and you start to think, well, why are they, it's like, it's racism, it's prejudice, it's, you know, it should be going on, why should they just assume that everyone is evil?